Hey everyone, we are here today. Ideally, it's been a very long time on my channel. If you guys are probably not avid watchers, but it's been a while since I've really just sat down and talked something out. Uh, it's been a while. It's because I stopped doing certain projects, and then if anything, I just kind of like um, if I sit down here and do something, it's for like maybe 10 minutes. So if anything, I'm definitely gonna speak for much longer than that. If you can tell by how long this video is, you can tell how much I have to say. Ideally, we are going to come on here and talk about supernatural character ideas or concepts or things that could revitalize the supernatural world. Dealey, we have, I think, reached a part in supernatural characters where I think a lot of times they say it's like, well, everything has been done. Has it? Has everything? Have we really scratched the surface of this? And I'm going to come up with some ideas, and there are going to be sketches on the thumbnail of some ideas that I have. And I might go further along than just the sketches on the thumbnail. I might talk a little bit more, depending on how much time I have. Anyways, first off, I'm going to discuss why I like supernatural things so much. Ideally, when looking at supernatural things, I thoroughly enjoy them just because whenever something isn't really explained, it is just pushed off to be a supernatural event. It is just like, well, that is just the unknown. That is the twilight zone, so to speak, of things that just like, and that just really fascinates me. Um, things like things that are just unexplained, where it's just kind of like a cold case file, where it's just like I just want to know, like I just want to know why like this happened or why this is the way it is, and there's just no answer. So it intrigues you more than something that can just easily be explained. Ideally, uh, things like the Bermuda Triangle, things like events and stuff like that. Roswell, supposedly alien crashing, and things like that. Things that really just cannot be explained, but is just kind of like hidden away in the midst of everything. Uh, but ideally, let's get into because that's why I just love supernatural things like Ghostbusters and the actual show on CW right now called Supernatural. I enjoy those kinds of things. Um, I enjoy movies and shows about vampires and werewolves and Frankenstein monster and evil genies and this and that and um, all kinds of things. The Wishmaster was a movie that a franchise that I enjoyed watching just because of how vastly different it was compared to everything else. Anyways, we are now going to start talking about some of the ideas that have been churning in my head for the longest time. If anything, it gets to a point where uh, I can even get like an Avengers team together of supernatural beings, and just call them the Unknown. Just because ideally, instead of coming up with a real name, why not just give them like a mysterious name like the Unknown? Um, but if anything, I hope nobody takes and steals these ideas and makes them their own, and then like ideally, I would love for if somebody wants to take one of these ideas and run with it, if they give me a credit of some kind. Uh, Ideally, it's like if you're gonna take, especially the artwork that I have, and make it your own. That would be pretty shady. But anything. Ideally, as I keep saying, ideally, my ideas, my concepts for supernatural characters. If anything, ideally, looking back on this can pretty much be my if somebody does eventually in the future come up with the same artwork, the same story, the same whatever, I can look back at this video and say, hey, I was the first person that came up with this. um, this is my this would be my kind of reason against that, whatever it's called. Um, Reason against somebody trying to take my ideas because I came up with them first. So, ideally, somebody could say it's like, well, this has been done at some point or something along those lines. If that is true, bring it up to me. I would happily enjoy reading that or seeing that if it's a movie or something like that. But anyways, on to the topics of Amari been blabbing for 7 minutes. Let's talk about a supernatural concept character ideas. Ideally, let's talk about the key supernatural characters. We gotta go and talk about them. Vampires, werewolves, and Frankensteins. Let's talk about those three characters and how we can reinvent them. Simply put, for vampires, I remember vampires being a lot of times just covered in blood. And it was ridiculous to me how, like, if you watch Deadpool, how he says it's like, dude, this is the reason why I wear red is because so that way you won't see me bleed. But even before that movie came out, this was a concept that was rolling around in my head because I seen too many monster and vampire movies where all of these characters are just doused in blood, and then they're running around, and then they have to hide the fact that they're doused in blood by throwing like a coat on and trying to hide. Like, why not just wear a full-on outfit that is red? So ideally, vampires, I would assume would be almost like a Red Riding Hood, and maybe there would be some fairy tale origin for why vampires. Maybe it can collide with the Red Riding Hood story with werewolves, vampires, and then I don't know about the Frankenstein. Maybe the Frankenstein was the lumberjack that tried to kill the wolf I don't know. But anyways, but that would kind of make sense to bring the Frankenstein back to life. But ideally, to keep him around to be the protector. I don't know. But anyways, going for vampires. I thought it was just kind of weird to me that, like on the show Being Human, it kind of interested me that a vampire was a doctor. I was like, oh wow, that is a smart idea because you got blood banks. It's right there. You can go and get it. But I would love it if vampires had some kind of career where it had something to do with knives. Whether it would be to be a doctor, like a surgeon, or a chef, or something like that. Because all of these vampires, I think when you look at a circus act, there is a guy that tends to throw knives at things. I think that would be perfect for vampires because they have the keen eye and they can throw knives. So if anything, instead of like pulling out guns to go up against somebody, and of course, a vampire against a vampire, of course, like wouldn't why wouldn't you use knives? So ideally, I would love it if when vampires uh, would go up against anybody, they would just have a load of just like knives they can just like pull from their waist and just have like a cleaver they can throw, and it would just be kind of like gangs in New York almost, where you have the main character who's a knife thrower and stuff like that. That would be so cool and visually interesting to showcase. Um, I I think it would be great to give vampires a new lease on life, and it would just make sense if vampires have some kind of disagreement of any kind or want to take control of something, they would have a like a throw off, meaning like how like darts at a dartboard, they would take knives and chuck it at like some kind of like dartboard of some kind, and then whoever would get the better score would win something. So ideally, we would get this to make sense to where why would they have so much bloodshed when they can just throw knives, and if somebody is the better knife thrower, then then they win something or they lose something. Ideally, it would mean a lot much more, um, because ideally you have where I think in the recent Blade things, it seems like a silver stake or whatever can kill a vampire. I think that's kind of ridiculous. Uh, Ideally, I think just any sharp object through the heart would kill a vampire. I don't understand why it absolutely has to be a wooden stake or a silver stake or a medium rare steak. uh, like it could just be a sharp object going through the heart, no matter what it is. But I really enjoy the whole if you chop off someone's head, that is like the definitive. Like if you chop off this person's head, they are dead. I love that answer as a definitive. Like if you chop off the head, they're dead. I like. There's so many times where you go for the heart and you don't hit it right, or you don't get it right, or it's in the wrong place, or some other thing, and it's just so annoying. Like, ideally, if you just go right for the head, if you take a lot of practice shots at the head, then more than likely you would be quicker to defeat this person. But I'm sure probably for story wise, it just makes for a much more thrilling story because then you can have the killer come back, or um, you can make for a longer fight because it's like, ha ha ha, you made the mistake of hitting me the wrong place. Or ideally, it would be interesting if vampires are known to have certain um, to have a certain spot where the heart is or something like that. It would be cool if a doctor would just like move the heart somewhere. So like, haha, well, my heart isn't in that same place. If anything, a different organ is moved there. So haha, like you made the mistake. Like there could be so many interesting different ways we could go about this. But I just love that knife chucking idea and that Red Riding Hood kind of outfit that vampires would have. And ideally, it would make sense for vampires to even be out during the day because they are nicely hooded, and they can go about their way. Maybe it'll be like they would have severe light sensitivity, but if anything, they can move a lot better if they're nicely hooded. They can still go through the day, and it would just make a lot more sense. So that way you wouldn't have to kill a character just because, oh well, the sun. It's like, no, they can just toss on the hood and they'd be okay, and they could do stuff during the day. Um, but anyways, I guess moving on because I probably spent so much time just talking about vampires. If anything, if people are interested, um, the hooded character is kind of the concept where I want to go with vampires. So if you like that drawing in the thumbnail, maybe if you are an artist, maybe we can come up with some kind of more backstories, and maybe we can come up with some kind of more story. But if anything, anyways, moving on to werewolves. I really enjoyed that in the Twilight movies, the werewolves were very tribal. But ideally, when I think of tribal kind of werewolves, like I want to think very much like werewolves have markers, meaning that they have symbols that tell you which werewolf tribe they're from, and also, and they have to wear these things all the time now that they are in these things. Meaning they could have some kind of actual like tattoo or brand on. They have to wear some kind of brand on their body, and they have to wear clothing that shows off their tribal markers. Ideally, so that way it doesn't conflict with. Ideally, so like they can make their presence known, and so that way, uh, other tribes can give them leeway if they have an alliance with that marker. Um, Ideally, I if you see like the almost like the Wolverine esque looking character on the thumbnail, that is kind of the concept of which I want to go about doing like a werewolf character. I really enjoy the original werewolf black and white movie. And I think that the problem with werewolf things is that the human part of the werewolf over time has completely gone away. Um, and I hopefully think that we can somehow go back to that. I Even though some people might think it's like, well, that was kind of like ridiculous, then like um how can you really tell that's a wolf and stuff like that? Because if a person is completely head to toe full with hair, wouldn't you be scared at that? Especially if they are. And if anything, my concept is looking at that character. It's lightly colored skinned. I would actually just because of how dark it would have been and how hard it would have been to just like tell where the hair is and the skin begins. Like ideally, I would say that the skin would have to be. fairly darker than whatever the actual person's skin tone is, meaning to make it look more like a dog's skin. Um, Whether it be a kind of, you know how dogs have kind of like either a very pinkish skin or very like shades of browns and dark browns and almost black. Um, that's where I'd kind of think that where a werewolf skin tone would change from human to werewolf. So ideally, this would be a real like transformation. It wouldn't just be like, oh, some guy just grew a lot of hair. If anything, the skin tone would change as well. But if anything, I am not fully immersed in a werewolf tribal story, just because I haven't really overly thought it through. But if anything, I would enjoy to do something with that all the same. Maybe mixing in vampire. Like, ideally, what we can do with every one of these stories, we can do separate stories, but then we can also make it a one big event story with all three of these kinds of characters. So maybe at first it'd be like a one off, one off, one off, and then we can combine all of these things into a story. I really have had so many, whether it be supernatural heroes or supernatural villains. So, ideally, I can think of some kind of something how all of these would coalesce together. If anything, but going on to the Frankenstein story, because of how much time I'm sure I probably have left. If anything, going on to the Frankenstein story. It's been quite a mass of many different kind of Frankenstein style stories that there's been. But ideally, there hasn't been a lot of stories where a person that has worked with like rubber kind of clothing, um, like how you see like electricians like wear a certain kind of rubberly styled outfits to protect them if they get electrocuted. Um, Something along those lines. If you watch like Ghostbusters 2 when they're in the subway and they're wearing the yellow getup in the subway slash sewer system, that is kind of like what I kind of like think of when I think of this Frankenstein gear. Um, but if anything, I like how, of course, you have a scientist who takes an electrified man and pulls him in and starts to go to work on him. Um, Ideally, like electrical super villain characters or superhero characters, um, ideally there is kind of something similar to this, but ideally we have where Frankenstein, you always have to do something with the head. Ideally, I think that we should just like that top part of the head, just like completely, you just take it off, and it would just be more interesting to see a fully functional brain of a Frankenstein. But if anything, we are doing just a little bit differently because electricity courses through this Frankenstein. If anything, if you see the one character with the lightning bolt through his skin, is because the electricity that shocked this person had created these electrified markers on this person's body. But this scientist bringing this person back to life um, keeps this person um, through means of eventually needing to get recharged, meaning this person will eventually maybe buy a solar powered house, would keep himself consistently charged. But ideally, the difference in all of these Frankenstein characters combined, like how I mentioned how the top part of the head off, um, because we are going to have electricity consistently flowing through this character. If anything, he will have electricity coming out of his eyes and electricity coming out of the top of his head, making it so you don't really see his eyes, and the electricity coming out of his head is his hair. um, Ideally, a different way of doing Frankenstein, but I think it just makes for an like it makes sense to have somebody electrified, um, and have that um, power within him, like actually visibly showing, um, to the point where this is maybe like the one Superman villain in one of the films where he consistently needs to be charged because he knows a percentage of how much power he has left within him, because you can tell as his electricity and his eyes and his head starts to fade, that he needs a recharge. And like ideally that would make a much more like kind of Green Lantern kind of story if this person was a hero, or it would still make kind of like a Green Lantern kind of story if this person was a villain. That he would just be a villain, like a Sinestro kind of a villain, just because he would, like any electrical like Doctor Doom kind of character, would shoot out his electrical power maybe through his mouth, or maybe through his hands. Maybe he would even simply use like static electricity to perform acts of some kind. But it would just make for interesting stories on how this guy would get his power. Whether it be him having, like maybe at one point, the hero can like, haha, you're running out of power, like you're not gonna. And then the Frankenstein kind of like opens up his coat. He's like, oh well, I have potatoes with electrical connections to me, so we're good. And then they can just keep going at it, and it would just be a funny way of workaround of how we can. Maybe he has like a potato backpack of some kind, I don't know, but it would just be interesting to see how we can make this monster, this I would just like to call him maybe like Frankie or something like just kind of keep with the Frankenstein thing, but maybe not call him Frankenstein. Maybe call him like Stein or Frankie um, or FS or something. I don't know. It would just be funny. But I guess if anything, we should kind of move on again, because I'm not 100% sure of the actual backstories of all these things. I'm not sure of the actual way that these stories are supposed to be told, but it would just be interesting to see how these would work in modern time, in modern stories, comics, movies, which would be groovy. Anyways, going on to the other, maybe more oddly strange thumbnail things because I might not have a lot more time left. If anything, I remember in if you guys, of course, have seen the Disney Aladdin movie, you'll have seen when, of course, Aladdin rubs the ramp, rubs the ramp, rubs the lamp. The genie comes out and it has a lot of smoke, and then you see the genie come up. Ideally, for the character that looks very much like pure smoke. This will explain this more. Ideally, whether it be a good genie or whether it be a bad genie, a djinn. Um, I like djinns, so I think this should just be the way it goes. Um, Ideally, I would love it if a djinn was, or a genie. Genie would probably be the easier thing for people to understand. Let's say an evil genie, so people can understand that better. It would be better if this character was purely made from smoke, and then maybe he would just toss on a pair of clothes or something like that, so that way he can look almost like a common person. But ideally, I would love it for a djinn or a genie to be made of pure smoke, and maybe because like it would make more sense if this genie was really that powerful, and there is no way to truly really defeat this person because he's made of pure smoke. Ideally, you can maybe use like a vacuum against him, like Casper did. The Casper movies did with the ghosts. You can maybe try and come up with all kinds of ways to maybe like evaporate this evil genie djinn. But really, ideally, the djinn or genie will just come back and just like, you need to finish these wishes. You have 3 wishes. You need to, or maybe we can even go as far as there's sometimes it seems like there's a different range of numbers for wishes. There might be 3, there might be 7, there might be whatever. But eventually, the djinn does have a reason for an ultimate goal of why he needs these wishes done. And maybe that will be explained by the hero to just be like, well, if I do all these wishes, what will happen at the end of this? And the djinn or genie will explain that. It's like, well, I will be free and I can, or I will be free to do whatever I want, or I'll unleash a evil genie djinn army. If anything, it's kind of miraculous how when you rub like a lamp or a light fixture of some kind, a genie should be able to come out, depending on how old the light fixture is, or because I think or a lantern of some kind. Ideally, I'd rather have it be a light fixture than like it's kind of weird to like a lamp, like a kind of. But anyways, I just like the genie concept. I love wish fulfillment episodes that get put on a horror or supernatural kind of thing. But anything, I guess, if you saw that cut and you saw me have to rebuttal, I'll have to talk about one last more character that I had a concept for. Here is a normal, just skeleton-esque looking character. The only difference is this skeleton-esque character can take his body apart. He can take his arms off, he can take his legs off, maybe hit you with it, maybe take his head off and do it like a bowling ball, and trip somebody, or something like that. Which I don't, I haven't seen that done a lot in supernatural kind of shows, and I think it would just make for an interesting villain or character just because of how uniquely he can take his own body parts and beat you with it. It would just make for, it would just be comic relief, and if anything, it would just be, if we're going with a supernatural rogues gallery, it would just be funny to see like a bunch of, like on Fright Night 2. There was a part in Fright Night 2 where there was a bunch of supernatural characters that were all in a bowling alley. And I would just love, in some kind of movie, comic book, something, for that to be a supernatural hideout, is to just kind of like recreate that scene in Fright Night 2 where you have like a skeleton guy who can take his head and bowl with it. And you have all these characters going, okay, well, what's the plan, guys? How can we defeat this supernatural hero? And maybe they would get like all together and fight him off. And maybe this bowling spot would just be like a neutral spot that no one can like kill each one another. And maybe it would just be funny if like there'd be just the common folk just kind of like naturally bowling and just like consistently like looking at this group, and the characters would just be like, could you not like look at us? And they were just like, okay. It's just throw their ball and like, yeah, we really need to go, honey. It would just be funny. But anyways, I think if you've seen the continuous cuts, that probably means that I should cut soon because I might have some issues editing. Ideally realize I have so many supernatural character ideas, so I can keep going with this thing. There are concepts that I have that I have artwork for, that I probably have some kind of stories for. There are things like the Creature Kid. There are things that are author, a mute character that can, whatever he writes down happens, and so on and so forth. I have so many things at my disposal that I can use. If people are interested to make some kind of story out of this, to make some kind of movie out of this, to make some kind of project or product or whatever out of this, and make some money, hopefully while using my name, giving me, of course, credit for being the originator of these ideas. So I am going to, I don't know if I'm going to come back to this because of how much time constraints I had. Ideally, I would, I don't know how much more I should go and maybe just talk about like the other team of group of people called the Unknown that I thought of. But ideally, I have this one character that's actually called Grimdeath, that I actually, that is from a nickname that I was given, and I actually made a actual character out of that, which is kind of a reaper, and he is a pirate-esque looking character in modern time, because reapers have to be neutral, and a pirate is probably the most neutral character that I can think of. And to put a pirate-esque looking character in modern times would be kind of funny. And ideally, I have so much concepts for just the Grimdeath character alone, of how he could fight any. But okay, I guess we have to say that that is a wrap there. I don't know, to keep going on and on and on about this. It probably won't go anywhere, or probably no one would care. But I like supernatural characters, and I hope that you do too, especially if you're watching this. So I am going to have to say good luck, good night, and goodbye, and I hope eventually somebody would like to do anything with the concepts I have had plethored around this channel. So I will have to say goodbye, everybody, because forcibly so, um, um, just because of how many cuts you're seeing here. So goodbye, everybody. Goodbye.